afraid of the dark.
I live in an old 9-story building on the top floor. I live alone. My mother passed away 4 years ago, and I never knew my father. I have no plans to get married yet. I'm focused on my career and planning to buy a better apartment, so I work a lot. Sometimes I come home only around midnight and spend another couple of hours with my laptop. One summer night, I was very late at the office. My boss needed a report that could potentially advance my career. I arrived home by taxi around 1 a.m. I decided that I would get a better sleep tomorrow, on Friday, and tonight, while I still had energy and desire, I would work on the details. While drinking coffee, I settled in the kitchen and opened the balcony. It was stuffy. My balcony had its pros and cons. There was no roof above it, so no neighbors above me littering with cigarette butts, and no living soul either, because our roof was locked by the building management to keep children and local drunks out. But the downside was minor. It was impossible to go out to smoke on the balcony when it rained. After finishing my coffee, I decided to refresh myself by going out to the balcony. Taking cigarettes and a matchbox, I crossed the threshold, and before me was a view of the city lights at night. Sitting on an old stool, I lit a cigarette. It was almost 2:30, and there were almost no cars. The city slept, and there was a piercing silence. After finishing my cigarette, I decided I would work for another hour and then go to bed. I sat down at my laptop and started checking, calculating, and writing. Suddenly, I distinctly heard rustling coming from the direction of the balcony. I became intensely curious about what it could be. Looking out onto the balcony, I didn't notice anything strange. I sat back at the computer. And again, I heard the rustling, but this time more clearly. It was footsteps. A thought flashed through my mind. I didn't hear anyone approaching the door to the roof. Usually when that door is opened, the lock rattles and the draft hits my front door, and when repairmen go up to the roof, I can hear every step they take. But this time I didn't hear any steps, and there was no draft either. Yet someone was on the roof. While my thoughts spun in my head, I heard the rustling again. Only now it was accompanied by some scraping, as if a cat were sliding down the building's finished tile. Gathering courage, I stepped out onto the balcony and looked up. To my surprise and fright, my legs carried me back into the apartment. From the edge of the roof, an ugly old woman's face was staring at me, framed by disheveled gray hair swaying in the wind. What was this old lady doing there? Why was she on the roof at this hour, and who let her in? A drunkard. But our building management can't stand them and always drives them away. Locked all the basements and entrances to the roof. There were only 2 with locks and kept the keys to herself. I peeked outside again and was dumbfounded. The old lady lowered her crooked hands down and scraped with all her might with her nails on the tile, causing small pieces of concrete and old finishing tiles to come off. I quickly closed the balcony doors and rushed out of the apartment to wake up our building manager. The woman, sleepy and angry, reluctantly opened the door, looked at me questioningly, wondering who the idiot was daring to wake up the neighbor at 4 a.m. I briefly told her about the crazy old lady. Then she quickly grabbed all her precious keys, and we rushed to the doors to the roof. I was amazed the doors and locks were in perfect order. We opened the doors and went up. The roof was empty. I circled all the corners, looked down, just in case, expecting to see her fall after all. but the lawns and flower beds illuminated by lanterns under the windows were ordinary. The building manager grumbled something under her breath, that I should sleep at night and work less, or else I'll lose my peace completely, locked all the locks, and went back to her apartment. I really started to think that I had imagined everything and overstayed. I returned home and fell asleep on the couch right in my pants and shirt. In the morning, I went out to the balcony to smoke. Something crunched under my slippers, and looking down, I saw pieces of tiles and concrete, remembering the night incident. Looking up, I naturally found nothing. I got ready for work, and leaving the apartment, met a crying neighbor from the floor who was standing with the building manager. It turned out her mother had passed away during the night, and they only found out in the morning, waiting for an ambulance to confirm the death. But the worst was waiting for me on the day of this old lady's funeral. I hadn't seen her in a long time. Once she was a full, lovely woman, but when they carried out the coffin, my horror knew no bounds. Lying in it was the same old lady, shriveled and skinny, and for a moment it seemed to me that the corner of her blue lips barely spread into a mocking smile. I won't work so much anymore, lest I see someone else on the roof of my building, or in my imagination. I have a friend, a former long-haul truck driver with years of driving experience. He's seen a lot in the 90s, a tough, fearless guy. Now he works in office security. That's where we met. Once at a corporate party over a glass of wine, he told me this story. Here's how it went from his words. I had a partner when we used to drive the roads of the country, and this partner had a grandmother living in the village, so they called him as her only relative. They said she passed away and needed to be buried next to someone familiar to avoid waiting for the great judgment alone. In Stevens City, his father is buried, the grandson of the old lady, so he decided to bury her next to his father, but the body had to be transported 300 kilometers. So he asked me to go with him. We took a car for transporting corpses from our friend. In the village, we said goodbye to the remaining old folks, loaded the coffin into the car's cabin, and set off. Honestly, I've driven alone many times, often at night, but I never had this creepy feeling I felt now with the corpse lying behind me in the coffin. I've seen a lot, buried my mother myself, but something was really unsettling now. After about 70 kilometers in complete silence, I suggested to Stephen to at least turn on some music, something light, to ease the tension. They were playing some cheap pop music on the radio, but at least it changed the atmosphere a bit. And just as we turned on the stereo, suddenly, with great force, from the back of the cabin, several dull blows rang out, as if someone was hitting the cabin with a boot from the trunk. We looked at each other. It wasn't our imagination, we both heard it. We stopped the car, listened intently, our hearts pounding, realizing that we had closed one coffin. There couldn't be anyone there. Everything was locked. The music continued to play softly. We sat there, not knowing what to do next. I reached for my gun in the glove compartment, and suddenly something scraped against the window behind us, inside the cabin where the coffin was. The curtain swayed, and again the banging strong and persistent. Stephen and I quickly jumped out of the cabin, scared out of our wits. It was getting dark, it was winter, the road was empty, and there was no one around. I said to Stephen, "Are you sure that Grandma is dead? Maybe she woke up and is asking for help, and here we are." two cheap kids sitting here gathering courage, we first called out to the grandmother's silence. We decided to open the rear doors of the van. We got out, walked around the car, gathered our spirits. Slowly we opened them. For some reason I had my gun ready, just in case. We jerked the doors open, and in that moment we realized we were screaming like two scared girls. Our old lady was lying next to the coffin lid was pushed aside, and the curtain in the window was torn. We ran away in the direction we came from, and when we realized we had no more strength to run, we stopped. Our jackets were in the van, the keys were there too. The doors were not locked, and we probably ran about 1 kilometer. I only had my gun in my hands. Luckily, I always keep cigarettes in my jeans pocket. We caught our breath, smoked 3 cigarettes, one after the other. It was getting cold. What to do? It was completely dark, so we decided to go back to the car. Nobody would think of stealing it with a corpse in the middle of the forest and fields. Luckily, an old man was driving in the direction we came from on an old pickup truck. We stopped, asked for a ride to warm up, and told him everything that happened. The old man chuckled, grinned, and asked us why we turned on the music. The deceased don't like disrespect. We arrived quickly. Our lonely car stood untouched by the side of the road, and who needs it in the middle of the forest and fields? Together with the old man, we went to see what was going on. The 3 of us put the grandmother in the coffin. The old man demanded that we apologize to her, closed the coffin lid, and locked the car doors. We drove the rest of the way in complete silence, smoking occasionally. There were no more incidents, and we arrived safely, if you can call it that. A week later, Stephen called me after 9 days had passed, when people gathered to remember the deceased. We sat silently together in the kitchen with 3 bottles of vodka. We talked about nonsense, work, who was going on which trips, and then raised our glasses to the grandmother. Sergei said that our friend not only has speakers installed in the driver's cabin, but also music playing throughout the car. People sometimes ride in there, it's more cheerful that way. We both remember perfectly well that we weren't driving fast to have the coffin tossing around the cabin. Maybe it was the potholes in the roads, or maybe she wanted to teach us a lesson to respect the dead.